Welcome and thank you for attending today's program, Regency Aesthetics, the costumes, locations, and decor of Bridgerton. My name is Lori Finkelstein and I am the director of Homewood Museum and Evergreen Museum and Library at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. For those of you new to us, Homewood Museum is a National Historic Landmark and one of the best surviving examples of federal period Palladian architecture in the United States. It was built circa 1801 for members of Maryland's prominent Carroll family. The house was also home to at least 25 enslaved individuals, including members of the Ross and Connor families. The museum tells the story of the intertwined narratives of these families as they relate to larger themes of the social history of the Baltimore area in early America. Before we get started, I would like to thank JHU's Sheridan Libraries and the Homewood Museum Advisory Board for their continued support of the museum. Today's program is being offered free of charge, but you too can help support the museum. If you would like to do so, please visit our website at https://museums.jhu.edu. Here you can learn about our membership program and other upcoming virtual presentations, and we will post this address at the end of today's lecture. I should note that the museum is currently closed due to the pandemic. Today's presentation is about 50 minutes in length, and we are pleased to answer questions at the end of it. Questions can be posted in the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A will be moderated by Barbara St. Hours, Museum Coordinator for Homewood Museum, who deserves a big thank you for all of her hard work in arranging the details of today's program. This presentation is being recorded and will be shared with all of you via email at its conclusion. Now, let me tell you a little bit about today's speaker. Michelle Fitzgerald is Curator of Collections at the Johns Hopkins University Museums. With an interest in Chesapeake furniture in the 18th and 19th centuries, she has previously held positions at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and the Maryland State Archives. She received her MA from the University of Delaware's Winterthur program in American Material Culture and her BA from University of Maryland at College Park. Michelle's writing has been published in the University of Chicago Press's Winterthur portfolio, and most recently in the American Association of State and Local Histories History News magazine. And it is my pleasure to now welcome Michelle to today's program. Take it away, Michelle.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us at Johns Hopkins University Museums for today's talk on everyone's favorite bit of this past winter, the latest bingeable television show and period drama, Bridgerton. Let's begin by going back in time 2 months or so to December 25th, as we, stuck in our homes almost a year into the pandemic, found a source of escapism in a Regency-era Netflix drama created by Shonda Rhimes. For a couple of hours, all of us got to relax into another fantasy world of crowded dance halls, beautiful costumes, intrigue, and big British country estates. Thinking about this show and what it can teach us about the early 19th century material world will be the focus of our talk today. Looking at examples from the show, specifically its architecture, furniture, and costumes, we'll discuss how they compare to what we historically know about the early 19th century, and why period dramas like this are so significant to our understanding of the historical past. Through the lens of Bridgerton, we begin to formulate a picture of the material world that made up early 19th century England's social and economic history. We can also consequentially use this to gain a further understanding of the American material experience, with many wealthy early Americans looking to England for inspiration, trade, and expanding social networks. Based on a series of popular romance novels by Julia Quinn, the show focuses on the fictional early 19th century wealthy Bridgerton family, their new money counterparts, the Featheringtons, and how these families interact with the Regency London marriage market. And as a quick semantic note, you'll hear me throughout this talk describe this period as Georgian or Regency, referring to early 19th century England when King George III was deemed unfit to rule due to illness, and his son, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, ruled by proxy. And in many ways, this show is really the perfect fit for discussion for one of our historic houses at Johns Hopkins University, and that's Homewood Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. Constructed in 1801 for the wealthy Maryland Carroll family as a country estate, our period of interpretation is largely 1801 to 1816, right around the time of this show. When we look at their lives in comparison to this show, we can identify several similarities between the newlywed Charles and Harriet Carroll, owners of Homewood, and the characters of Bridgerton and how they experience an upper-class world. The Ton, as the character's high society circle is referred to in Bridgerton, was alive in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and DC, comprised of a certain class of early American families who were traveling, courting, marrying, and feuding between each other in a series of social events and entertainments. To enjoy these circles, Americans relied on the wealth built upon the inhumane practice of slavery. The Carroll family's wealth, for instance, came in part from ownership of large tracts of land worked by enslaved laborers. As the show mostly focuses on a select wealthy elite, I think it's important to keep that foundation for some wealth in this period in the back of our minds. And before I dive too deeply into historical comparisons, I want to note that the designers, actors, and writers of the show intentionally use 2020 era visual signals for the audience to get across 1813 feelings, senses, and experiences. The show was designed to be escapist, and I think that's something that's important for us to remember in our assessment. Bridgerton is a fantasy rather than a 100% accurate translation of Regency England, and basing our discussion of the show today solely in historical critique wouldn't totally set us up for the compelling perspective on the period that Bridgerton provides. When we talk about complete historical accuracy and popular entertainment, we would really be setting any show up for failure, because there's always new findings and scholarship shifting what we know. I also want to acknowledge one of the most debated components of Bridgerton, which is its depiction of race. The show was not cast colorblind, meaning that race was a consideration in the casting and is briefly addressed in the plot. The result is a more diverse picture of Regency London than we are used to seeing. While the white characters in the show do not seem to always recognize this diversity, the characters portrayed by actors of color do appear conscious of racial differences, and this does come out in at least one compelling conversation between an older and younger character. One of the most discussed casting decisions in this regard is the casting of Queen Charlotte, who is also one of the few real people portrayed in the series. Her casting appears to have been based on historical theories that Charlotte may have been distantly of African descent. This is a hotly debated topic among many historians, so it's interesting that they chose to really utilize it. I know there are a lot of discussions surrounding Charlotte in this show, so I do encourage you to explore this and decide for yourself whether you think it's a successful narrative or not. I think you see the impact of the decision to situate the show in a seemingly less racially oppressive past trickle through all its components, including its material culture. Similarly, throughout the series, Bridgerton acknowledges its historical setting without allowing the debates of historians to limit it in its retelling, resulting in interesting discussions of how these two worlds, the fictional and the real early 19th century, might compare. So on that note, let's dive right into that material world. And we're going to begin with the setting that this story takes place in. While much of this plot line is a fantasy, the locations are largely drawn from the historical past and surviving structures from the period. For instance, our main setting for most of the show is Grosvenor Square, London in 1813, where the Bridgerton and Featherington families lived. This location is announced almost immediately in the story and quickly clues us into a lot about the characters we are meeting. Grosvenor Square still exists in present-day Mayfair in England. You can actually see it on the map here, just to the upper right of the picture. Originally developed between 1725 and 1732 by Sir Richard Grosvenor, this part of the city was one of the most fashionable residential addresses in London until the Second World War. By the time Bridgerton takes place, many of the buildings had already been remodeled from their original construction to highly fashionable Regency-era buildings and surrounded one of the larger garden squares in the city that was designed with this wild look to be intentionally romantically reminiscent of the countryside. So to open the show with a nod to this location, we instantly know two things about these neighboring families. One, they are very wealthy to afford such a fashionable address, and two, They are interested in being involved in society and moving in fashionable, entitled circles. The design team also made extensive use of real historic buildings as the backdrop of the characters' worlds. While some of these buildings are private today, some you can visit, including the Holborn Museum of Art, which served as the exterior of Lady Danbury's residence, and number 1 Royal Crescent, the exterior of the Featherington's home, which I'll show you an image of in just a moment. Both of them are museums located in the Regency city of Bath, which is located not too far outside of London. You probably recognized a couple other locations yourself in your viewing. Some of the sites are quite well known. Maybe most famously, Hampton Court Palace, which was used as a stand-in for the Queen's residence. While Lancaster House, which is now used by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, was used for a lot of her interiors. So let's break this down a little bit further and chat a little about some of the private spaces and residences of the characters. For the Bridgerton's house, RAF Halton, one of the UK's largest Air Force stations, made up several interior shots. While Ranger's house, which is an art museum located in Greenwich, was used as the predominant exterior location. I particularly like the use of Ranger's house as a Grosvenor Square stand-in, given its 1722 construction date, placing it a little early, but right around the time the square was developed, and the maintained brick facade and Palladian style. This is clearly one of the earlier homes in the square that maybe hasn't been updated into the latest style, suggesting this is an old money family who is pretty comfortable with their status within society. And I should note, Palladianism, in the context we are talking about with this house, is a movement that was popular in early 18th century England. It is an interpretation of the designs of a 16th century Italian architect, Andrea Palladio, whose designs equated symmetry with morality and mirroring rightness in nature. And you can really break down the style into a couple of key traits. First is the Palladian window, where you have this arched window flanked by columns. You can also see a temple front portico added to the front of the building, hearkening to ancient Roman structures, which was actually not always possible in townhouses. So you sometimes instead see temple front style door surrounds and a fan light over the door, like this example. And finally, above all else, there is symmetry in all parts of construction, sometimes leading to oddities like blind windows used to maintain that exterior appearance of proportion, even when you did not want to put a window into a certain spot. And this architectural style is something you really see take off in early 19th century America, just as it was waning in England. Homewood echoes all of these Palladian details and is considered one of the premier examples of Palladian architecture in the United States. Perhaps the biggest difference, though, between this house and similar ones you may find in England is how it is built with consideration to a different climate. The homes in Bridgerton are designed for a generally colder climate than the ones in the Chesapeake, which frequently were built with more attention to the circulation of air during often muggy and hotter summers than those you'd see in England. But returning to our fantastical Grosvenor Square, let's contrast that with the Featheringtons, where number 1 Royal Crescent in Bath was used as its exterior. Unlike the Bridgerton's residence, number 1 Royal Crescent was a townhouse constructed between 1767 and 1774, so about 50 years after the Bridgerton's house. It was designed in the most popular fashion of the early 19th century. So you can note the use of limestone that we tend to connect with early 19th century exteriors instead of the brick that you saw at the Bridgerton's house. This look enhances our impression that this is a family with new wealth that is hyper-conscious of fashion, potentially even insecure of their place in society. And that is why they're making such an effort in their house. Number 1 Royal Crescent is our contemporary concept of the fashionable townhouse and speaks to a lot about how the production team wanted us to view this family from the get-go. And the use of Bath as a stand-in for Regency London is a really effective design choice because these architecturally consistent exterior scenes cements our characters as part of the early 19th century world of up-to-date fashion. While early 19th century London would have seen more of a sort of mishmash of construction eras, Bath grows extremely quickly in the late 18th century. Because many of the buildings in the city center are constructed from the conveniently available and popular Bath limestone, The city makes for a wonderful time capsule of high fashion in the very period that Bridgerton was filmed. Unlike Bath's consistent architecture, when we move to the countryside, there tends to be more of an amalgamation of styles, which the show actually does particularly well in their design of the Duke of Hastings' house. His house is a combination of a couple sort of greatest hits of country houses. The exterior uses Castle Howard, a 16th century estate in the English Baroque style, which you might have most famously seen in Brideshead Revisited. While the interior shots utilize Wilton House, also 16th century, which you've also seen in The Crown, the 2020 version of Emma, and 2004's Pride and Prejudice, and Badminton House, which was constructed in the 17th century. Of course, none of these houses were built in the century that Bridgerton was set in, and that makes a lot of sense. Established titled families often had estates dating back many generations, so the use of an ancient manor house is significant to the Duke of Hastings, whose title, according to the show, appears to be only about 2 generations old. It raises the question of how the Duke may have gotten this estate. Maybe his family purchased the historic property from another family. Perhaps they held the property before gaining the title, or something else altogether not yet revealed. All the same, I cannot look at this without thinking of Downton Abbey's Mary Crawley when she states in reference to furniture, quote, "Your lot buys it, my lot inherits it," end quote, and think that there might be something more to the Duke's title and house. And unlike all of us right now, the Bridgerton's world is not just restricted to the house. They make extensive use of public spaces throughout the show. The ball scenes in Bridgerton, of which there were plenty, did a fantastic job of capturing the essence of what these spaces may have been like. While sometimes some of the decor for the scenes could be over the top, it very effectively communicates the grandeur and impression that these balls gave off. These were crowded events that offered young people the opportunity to socialize and court and dance. The Bath assembly rooms were some of the most popular public spaces for balls, with Bath offering at least 2 balls a week during the social season of October to June. Described as, quote, "the most noble and elegant in any kingdom," end quote, the spaces tended to be colorful with tall ceilings, boldly decorate, and I reiterate, very crowded. However, Bridgerton does not limit the social forays of young characters to just balls and assembly rooms. They also show us some of the other high society spaces that demonstrate the diversity of activities that would encompass a social season, including theaters, parks, and salons. In one scene in particular, we see our characters in an art gallery that appears intended to be the Royal Academy, a display space for up-and-coming artists often looking for the patronage of elite members of society. And you can see an image of the real Royal Academy on the right side of the slide here. A joke in this scene regarding whether a painting placed at eye level should have been higher up speaks to a practice by the Royal Academy of placing what it perceived as its best works at eye level and reserving more awkward spaces for the lesser works. And I thought that was a really fun Easter egg when I saw them doing that. The use of public gardens in several scenes also takes our setting outdoors. Excursions into public parks during the social season was a fantastic excuse to socialize, court, and gossip, while also getting some air outside of all those interiors that we've just looked at. One of the most famous real-life counterparts to these scenes are the Vauxhall Gardens, which operated as a pleasure garden in London between 1785 and 1859. Pleasure gardens like Vauxhall, as opposed to garden squares like you would see in Grosvenor, charged tickets for admission, meaning that anyone who could pay could get in, and drew enormous crowds for entertainments worthy of Bridgerton, including fireworks, tightrope walkers, garden volleys, and paths intended for couples to retreat into. What all of these spaces, from the parks to the house exteriors, do very well is highlight the importance of being seen. Vantages of homes and opportunities in public spaces to present oneself emphasizes the intensely performative social atmosphere that comprises the world of these characters, as well as the historic reality. And now that we've covered a bit of the setting of Bridgerton, let's touch a little on the furnishings and miscellaneous objects that fill these sets. Of course, touching on every single object and every frame would be way too much to dive into. And because I don't want to hold you all hostage here deep into tomorrow, we'll just touch on some of the most recognizable interiors from the show and talk about some of the things that stand out and speak to the relationship between the show's storytelling goals and historical accuracy. As we touched on before, most of the grand interiors of this show were built on sound stages, with a lot of the historic houses being limited to exterior or particular interior shots. In part, this is due to the furnishings. As the director of the show noted, quote, "When you go into a country house, there's far less flexibility than you can ever imagine. You can't move the bed, you can't move the painting, you can't move the wardrobe, and you have to be quite delicate with the furniture," end quote. For the sites they did shoot in, they added lots of big drapery, flowers, and furniture of the right colors to fit the design goals of the show. So the final picture we're looking at tends to be a fusion of a carefully designed color palette that shifts with the moods of the show within a historic setting. But let's begin with the Bridgerton's double parlor, which is used extensively as a space for both family and visitors throughout the show. The piano pictured on the right here is one of the most prominent objects in the space and is used frequently by Daphne to express her emotions. If this object initially looked like a harpsichord to you, you were not alone, because I thought the same thing until Allie Cade, senior curator at the Sigel Music Museum, pointed out that early pianos look very similar to harpsichords. So the piano used in Bridgerton is labeled as a Longman and Broderip, who were one of a few London workshops producing these instruments in the early 19th century. While the piano was technically invented in the early 18th century, you don't see it starting to become prevalent until almost 100 years later. As a fairly new piece of popular technology on the market, Daphne's piano was also a notably expensive object for the family to own, underscoring the family's wealth once again. While the London-made square pianos of the era, such as this example at Homewood, were somewhat more accessible, owning a piano was still overall something exclusive to the wealthier classes. And the piano was, of course, a valuable tool to display musical talent, a necessary accomplishment for any young lady to show off in the period as part of her education. In fact, you actually see a lot of Jane Austen characters making use of similar instruments, especially in the movies. I'd argue it's an especially valuable tool for Daphne because the piano is one of the first keyboard instruments that allowed her greater control of volume and registration, allowing her to display her emotions to the audience musically, since social conventions sometimes restricted her from conveying it verbally. And then moving back to the parlor, we also see a rather high number of armchairs and sofas that I love how the family uses. They're frequently slouching and lazing on them in a way that kind of goes against our thinking of these antiques as exclusively for more formal sitting. Given the Bridgerton family's enjoyment of this blue color scheme, their selection of French-style painted armchairs and sofas makes for a really nice combination. In fact, a lot of their furniture tends to be influenced by a French style that becomes particularly popular around this period, especially in the United States, which was trying to stylistically distance itself just a bit from its former colonizer. Ironically, though, as the Bridgerton's parlor attests, an interest in French style also existed in England. I would say probably one of the most famous period examples of these chairs, at least to the American mind, is the set that DC cabinet maker William King produced for the White House in the early 19th century. The chairs have even popped up in some presidential portraits from time to time. So this selection of chairs for the Bridgertons in the French style is a really nice nod to the family stylishness of the period in a way that we may also recognize today. Moving, though, through the Bridgertons' house and into the dining room, we were gifted this great dining room scene in the middle of the season to play with, in which the Duke comes to dinner and dines as a guest with the family, including all of the kids. It's commented on in the show, but the children being present for a formal guest or potential suitor visit is a little unusual. Pushing that aside, though, the striking irregularity for me here is a very common Hollywood sin. There are so many candles in the shot, just so many. And in the early 19th century, for a wealthy family, the candles would have likely been made of beeswax, which burns quickly. It drips a bit, though not as much as its stinky alternative, animal fat, and it requires a lot of attention. So generally speaking, we probably would have had less candles lighting the tables. The tableware, though, is really great. You can just barely make out in this screenshot. I had to replay this scene once or twice to get a good look, but I think that we have some Amari plates out and being used. And The mari was a very colorfully decorated ceramic style that initially came out of Japan. While the Dutch did have a trade relationship with Japan, England's trade was predominantly connected with China via the East India Company. So the Bridgertons would likely be dining on Chinese export porcelain here that was based on design from Japanese export. We also have, you might notice, all of the food laid out at once on both the table and the sideboard. And one character actually gets up at one point and gets food off the sideboard. And I really love that sort of detail there. This is service à la française, or service in the French style, and was an older dining style where all of the food was brought out simultaneously. Right at the time that this show takes place, a new service called service à la Russe in the Russian style was just hitting the scene, where food came out in courses. This had the downside at the time of having to wait for the slowest eater to continue with your dinner and a higher number of staff needing to be in your employment, but had the advantage of food being warmer when it reached the diner and ensuring that everyone got to have a taste of everything. This style, though introduced in France in 1810, didn't become the norm in England until much later in the 19th century. So it's a really nice touch that they have this earlier form of dining in this scene. And a lot of what we are seeing in this scene, apart from the candles, is a really well depicted example of what we would have seen in a dining room like Homewood's at the time, with similar food, dining style, tableware, and even glassware layout, which I also have to commend them for doing quite a nice job with. A significant difference between the scene in Bridgerton and the reality at Homewood, of course, would be the staff who would be waiting on the guests and serving the diners. While Homewood used enslaved labor, a family in England was more likely to have employed servants, though it is worth noting that these non-slave owning families in London often financially benefited through markets that relied on enslaved labor. Historically speaking, we're in a really interesting period of time. In Britain, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807, prohibiting the slave trade, but did not actually abolish the institution of slavery in the British Empire until 1833, 20 years after this show takes place. So to me, this dining scene also raises the question of, where did the Bridgerton family money come from? Is slavery entirely gone from this iteration of the early 19th century British Empire? Did it end with Queen Charlotte's marriage to King George and not impact the economy? Or is this inhumane system still in place and as of yet unacknowledged explicitly by the characters? They're not questions that we can answer directly from the show right now, but they're really important to keep in mind as we continue to engage with it. And while the Bridgertons highlight many trends of the era, some of the boldest expressions of fashion is left for the Featheringtons and their parlor. I am all about this space. There's just so much going on in it. And like the Bridgertons' parlor, this is also used as a private and public living space, which you might actually expect this family to have a separate, more casual parlor to hang out in. But this one really hits you with an extensive amount of color and giltwork. What I love about this space in particular is the Klysmos chairs that dominate it a little bit more than at the Bridgertons, though there are one or two of them there as well. When you think about Regency era chairs, as I'm sure you frequently do, this is the chair. Modeled off of the ancient Greek Klysmos chairs, these pieces were all the fashion at the time, and the style was really invigorated by a man the Featheringtons pay a lot of homage to, the interior decorator with a very interesting portrait, Thomas Hope. After establishing himself in London, Hope decorated his home in an extremely elaborate style, merging together styles he had picked up across Greece, the rest of Europe, and the Ottoman Empire. His spaces were colorful, bold, and a bit showy, much like the Featheringtons' personal taste. And in general, the Featherington parlor is a blast because it's pulling from the biggest and boldest things you could find from period sources. From the glass chandelier with all of its drippings to the elaborately draped curtains, they all come straight out of period imagery to a really awesome effect. Just take a look here at the curtains in an early 19th century style magazine and how they compare to the set dressing. But speaking of the chandelier, I want to just emphasize how ridiculously elaborate the chandelier was. Glass chandeliers could range dramatically in cost, from 60 pounds for a simple 6-arm one with drippings, which are those hanging parts that are not structurally integral to the light source, to ones that cost hundreds of pounds with several arms and constant required maintenance. The latter were ordered by the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire from the craftsman William Parker. Parker is perhaps most well known for his chandeliers in the Bath Assembly Rooms, pictured here on the left. And those chandeliers, as a side, actually come with a great story. Parker ended up with the commission from Bath after the former commission awarded to Jonathan Collette proved that you can, in fact, have too many drop glass ornaments on a chandelier. If you all remember how crowded those rooms were when we talked about them earlier, imagine how happy those individuals were when a very heavy glass object suspended from the ceiling turned into a candlelit weapon and crashed to the floor in the middle of the ball. So for the Featheringtons to have not just a chandelier, but a glass ornamented one shows just how much they were willing to spend for style and appearance, as well as showing off just how exclusive this club of individuals was to afford the style demands of the period. Moving away from parlors for a moment, though, let's look at an even higher status individual, the Duke of Hastings and his study. And I'm not going to lie to you, the main reason I wanted to show off this study was because of this great Chippendale-made desk and bookcase in the corner here, which makes me very happy because that's a famous commission by Thomas Chippendale and Son made for Wilton House. Active in the 1750s through his death in 1779 in London, Thomas Chippendale's furniture can be found in many of the most well-known country houses in England and Scotland. His published designs, The Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director, make him one of the most well-known cabinet makers to this day. And I just love the violin carving at the front of this bookcase. The bookcase, being Chippendale, is about 46 years earlier than a lot of the other styles we're looking at, but it likely would have stayed in the study, whether the Duke wanted to redecorate or not, for both its usefulness and its opportunity to show off some extremely finely grained wood. Chippendale's influence by the printing of his pattern book captured a style that reverberated across the Atlantic to become spectacularly influential in 18th century American furniture. By the early 19th century, even in the United States, the more movable objects in this style migrated to service areas in the house, like the butler's pantry in the case of this Philadelphia-made chair in the Homewood collection. However, large significant pieces like the Chippendale bookcase may have remained in public rooms because, much like the country houses that we discussed earlier, wealthy families might retain older pieces without regard to whether they are currently in style, as a signifier of their long-standing wealth. For any of you, by the way, looking for some key components of this style, one of the easiest ways to identify it with Chippendale-style chairs is the embellishment at the top crest rail of the chair that makes it look like it has little ears. I think it's super cute with these chairs. But apart from this super fun bookcase, the other thing that really jumps out to me in this scene is the equine art behind the Duke. You also see this a bit in the Bridgerton study, and you hear the men occasionally mention horses in dialogue between each other. This is a great nod for a space to read in the period as masculine, with horse racing being a frequent male bonding and gambling activity of men of a certain wealth bracket. When these individuals had a particularly successful horse, they would commemorate it with a portrait. And while we frequently have the names of the horses depicted in the images, we rarely have the names of the servant or enslaved individual who may also have been painted in holding the animal. For many portraits of men from the period, we do tend to see them in an environment evocative of a study or another masculine reading space. Bridgerton does a really good job highlighting these spaces to show the segmented class and gender atmosphere that these characters are moving through. It's a subtle reminder, at least to me, that we're really only glimpsing a very small fraction of the entire material world of this period, limited by the characters' ability and comfort levels with accessing spaces. For instance, a set of interiors that we really only get glimpses of throughout the show are the servant spaces. These spaces we always experience from the Bridgertons' perspectives, and they are often uncomfortable, lost, or don't know how to use the tools within the space, which serves to really highlight those class differences. In many of these grand buildings we were looking at earlier, huge amounts would have been dedicated to servant spaces, which would have been unfamiliar to members of the landowning family. The glimpses we do get of the spaces, though it's difficult to tell too much, are fairly accurate for servant spaces in England. They're simply but cleanly furnished. One of the things that does stand out in this behind the scenes shot, for instance, is the ceramics displayed on the cabinet behind the actors. The objects displayed offer a great glimpse of a mixture of blue and white transferware and Chinese export porcelain, which transferware is imitating. The collection is fairly random rather than matched. You might expect more matched sets from the time period, and some of the forms may not be perfect for the 1810s. However, they offer a great example of something that may have been used by servants in the house. While the Bridgertons were probably dining on porcelain, English-made transferware could be mass-produced and was cheaper by consequence. An important thing to note, though, as we draw comparisons between Homewood and England, is that these spaces do not accurately represent living conditions for the enslaved workforce in the United States. In houses like Homewood, individuals were forced to live and labor with significantly less privacy and comfort. So we're looking at a very English sort of style here. Now, the final topic we'll be covering today is, let's be honest, what brings most of us to period dramas, and that's those fantastic and elaborate costumes. While there are certainly many reviews online that point out a lot of the historically inaccurate costuming on the show, and likely some of it jumped out to you yourself, for the most part, they do a generally pretty good job fusing a historical atmosphere with intentional design choices. And these sorts of historical nods and hints really come out when we look at the designer thoughts on these pieces. I should note that over 7,500 costume pieces were made for this show. So truly a massive amount of thought and effort was put into creating an overall aesthetic that would read with 2020 viewers. The show's costume designer in interviews really makes clear her feelings on a strictly historically accurate design, clearly stating in one interview with Slate magazine, quote, "Being 100% historically correct was not on our agenda at all," end quote. And in another interview with The Cut, which you can see on this slide, that the show, quote, "is a fictionalized version of 1813 and the Regency era. I cannot emphasize fictionalized enough," end quote. And you can really see where the designer plays with these emphases, particularly with multiple bold colors, modern fabric choices, glitter, and general over-embellishments. This is especially the case with the Featheringtons, for which the designer notes, quote, "The Featheringtons are new money, and they aren't educated in the same way. They want to make a statement, and they want to be accepted," end quote. And that pairs with what we've been seeing with their furniture and choice of setting always being the most fashionable to the point of parody. This is very apparent in the costumes, where almost all the other characters keep an 1810 silhouette, except Mrs. Featherington on the right here, who is wearing something closer to a 1910 silhouette with some 1950s influence in the cuts. The mix of costume consistency for most of the characters is a really amazing array of colors that show that bright tones were used in the 19th century. It doesn't give us the Regency England we're familiar with on film from Jane Austen depictions, where most of the female characters are in muted whites and pastels. Instead, we're looking at a field of costumes intended to dazzle, which gives an impression similar to how someone looking in on high society would have felt in the early 19th century. In order for us to feel that visual impact, the designers had to go above and beyond historical accuracy in order to have an impact on a 21st century audience. And the dazzle effect fits in nicely with historical precedent among early 19th century trendsetters. Among the Baltimore elite, there is truly no better example than Betsy Patterson Bonaparte, who likely visited Homewood during her time in Baltimore society. At one point, Bonaparte very famously attended at least one party in a gown so sheer that Rosalie Calvert, a total gossip, wrote that she was, quote, "wearing a dress so transparent that you could see the color and shape of her thighs and more," end quote. The sheerness and whiteness of Bonaparte's dress that was described is made possible through an increase in imported high-quality silks, muslins, and cottons coming out of India, speaking to the significance of trade in this material world that we're looking at. Now, while the show typically doesn't use an excessive amount of light fabrics, you do see evidence of this trade through, I would argue, their use of colors and patterns, which are reminiscent of block printed textiles also coming out of India via this trade. On the men's side, another famous name you may have heard who really depicts this interest in fashion is Beau Brummel, whose consistent muted color scheme, tailored coats, and breeches is exemplified here in this image on the right. In fact, Brummel during the Regency era was such a fashion model that some men, including the Prince of Wales, would regularly attend to watch him change and select his outfit. When we go into this discussion of early 19th century clothing and high society circles, we are really thinking of styles that give off the impression of dazzling. So I think the designer's work to that overall impression is really cool. More than anything else in regards to the costuming in this show, I love the colors of the garments. They so nicely evoke colors of the period. You probably also notice that particular colors are associated with specific family groupings. The Bridgertons, for instance, in general, have a very distinctive blue that is literally everywhere when a member of this family is in sight. Their gowns are, generally speaking, among the main characters, the most historically accurate for a family of this status in 1813. So it should be no wonder that this color actually could be a reference to the famous blue shade found on the potter Josiah Wedgwood's jasperware. Developed in the 1770s, the relief decorations of contrasting colors and matte finish give this stoneware a unique cameo effect. Wedgwood jasperware, particularly in the present, I would argue, is one of the most evocative images of the Regency period and a certain concept of Englishness that the Bridgertons represent. Interestingly, Josiah Wedgwood was also an abolitionist who famously created and widely distributed these "Am I Not a Man and a Brother" medallions that assisted in spreading abolitionist causes in the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, by massive contrast to the Bridgertons, the Featheringtons are largely sporting colors that were not even invented yet, including magenta, which was discovered in the 1860s, and that bold neon green that I somewhat associate with a toxic uranium glassware produced in the 1830s. What that serves to do, though, is really show off a richness of color from this family that is kind of lost today in surviving material. While the garments that have survived have aged and yellowed and muted with time, the designer stated she wanted to emphasize the feeling of what once was, and that comes across really well with these colors. But I can truly go no further into our case studies before I make the note that for all of its successes I'll give it, unfortunately, Bridgerton did open the show with a corset lacing scene. And before even getting into the form itself, a corset, particularly in the early 19th century, would not be tightened to the point of fainting discomfort. They were intended as supportive garments, not torture mechanisms, and designed to achieve the fashionable silhouette of the era. In this scene, our character is wearing a full corset down to her hips that's intended to create an hourglass figure. This would be a very helpful shape to have, certainly in the second half of the 19th century, but in 1813, when their gowns are loose around the waist, it doesn't really serve a purpose. Instead, in this period, we would probably expect to see transitional stays, which are not corsets, but rather supportive garments that created an unrestricted silhouette. As opposed to the boning that you see in a later corset, these stay structures usually came from a center wood busk board slid into the stay, an example of which you can see in this slide here. You do see these a bit in the undressing scenes later as well, which is kind of a nice touch. But I should also note that none of these women seem to be wearing a chemise under their stays or corsets, which they would have done in the period. So it's honestly no wonder that Daphne Bridgerton has marks on her skin from the corset pushing in. Of course it was uncomfortable. She didn't have any fabric protecting her there. But among the female characters, one of the ones who probably achieves the closest example of a period accurate costume is Eloise Bridgerton, who is showing off day clothes in this screenshot. You'll note that she actually has a garment covering the space between her bust and her neck, which you would expect to see more of in the daytime. She is also wearing the closest thing to a head covering that we really get to see in this show. The designers note several times in interviews that they didn't want to go with a more period look of bonnets and top hats for the main characters, but they do attempt to nod to this fashion with hair pieces, like what Eloise has on here. Among the men, the Duke of Hastings is just truly a mess in his fashion upkeep. No doubt to give him the male protagonist and a contemporary romance look, his cravat, which is the stiff starch fabric band around his neck, is frequently undone or missing. In the early 19th century, that would be kind of a social faux pas to go out in public like that. He also, in some scenes, actually appears to be wearing a black shirt, which wouldn't have really been around at the time. White was generally the favored color for shirts, as you can see in the period image on the right on this slide. But frankly, the strangest thing to me about the men's clothes is that the buttons on the men's coats go all the way down the coat instead of stopping at the waist. This isn't historical to my knowledge. You can't button these coats all the way down, and doesn't make life easier for the designers. So I don't quite get it. If anyone has any ideas as to why they opted to do this, please let me know. I'd be really curious. And at the risk of sounding too critical, I do think they show off a variety of male fashions of the era really well, with good layering, the use of colors again, and inclusion of little accessories like watch fobs on the costumes. Colin Bridgerton in particular is the period accurate fashion character to look out for. And his waistcoats are especially fabulous. So I encourage you to keep your eyes on him in future seasons. The evening attire for the balls worn by the characters is a little all over the map, but for the most part does a good job retaining the period silhouette. Actually, the only thing that I personally really noticed in regards to this was just the sheer amount of different dresses the characters had for the season and the frequency of their visit to the dress shops. Fine period textiles of the era were expensive, and most of the characters may have had 1 to 2 new gowns prepared at the beginning of the season that they would have reworn. This contrasts a bit with the costume designer's assessment that, quote, although we have fictionalized the Regency period, 1813, there's still the basic truth. The girls wore a different dress to every ball, end quote, which is an overstatement. The other thing that comes across once again at the balls is the hair. Daphne's wispy bangs and updo is not wrong, but isn't the most stylish for the era. Temple curls, like you may see in many Regency portraits, were much more popular. However, Daphne's propensity for the half up, half down hairstyle is totally modern. I think the designers may have been going for a modernized side ringlet look, like the character Penelope is sporting here on the lower right, a little bit more successfully. A very interesting hair choice, though, made in these big social events is the Queen's. She sports many wigs, which are really fading out of fashion by the early 19th century, but we'll get to that in just a moment. And these are an amazing fusion of modern inspiration and Georgian English wig looks. A particular one that really stands out to me was said by Mark Pilcher, the show's hair designer, to be inspired by Beyonce in the film Austin Powers and Goldmember, while also exaggerating and maintaining that frizzy sort of late 18th century wig silhouette that you see in this period image. But on the late 18th century note in general, you may have noticed that the Queen and her ladies stand out in costuming from the rest of the characters. That would be because their fashion is about 40 years earlier than everyone else's, dating to around the 1770s to 1780s. And according to the costume designer, this was because, quote, once she became Queen Charlotte in the 18th century, she never changed her silhouette, and that was until the day she died, end quote. And this isn't exactly true, as portraits and examples of her surviving gowns depicted here will attest. The grain of truth, though, in this statement is that the historical Regency court did have some seriously outdated style components. Most notably was that hoop skirts were still required by Queen Charlotte for court dress. However, instead of wearing silhouettes and styles from the 1770s or 1780s, people visiting court basically just modified Regency dress to fit a hoop skirt underneath. As you can see from these images, this is/was a total fashion disaster, and no one should ever really feel bad about style trends they followed as a teenager after looking at these. You probably also noticed that none of the characters in Bridgerton wear anything remotely similar to this when at court. And as fun as it would have been to see them in these dresses, I do get how it may have been difficult to convince a contemporary audience that these characters were in high fashion circles wearing these ensembles. So instead, what we have in the court scenes is something more similar to a French court dress, and it does a fairly decent job with that. One of my favorite details in this court scene as well are these large feathers in the hair of the ladies being presented, which does align with styles in Charlotte's court of ladies wearing a single large ostrich feather. So we've spent the past hour or so learning a lot about the historical nuggets that we can find when watching Bridgerton. But I think the most important thing we can learn from this show is perhaps the whole reason we are drawn to any show, period or not, in the first place. The basic humanity of the characters, their abilities to joke, yell, slouch, run, play, be tired, or be excited reminds us that these people of the past were not static, stiff figures that we might think of, because all we have to remember them are occasionally documents, formal portraits, or the things they left behind. Even that said, though, there are pieces of our 18th and 19th century material world that do remind us of this in small ways, such as this portrait of Maryland's last colonial governor, Robert Eden, here in England in the 1780s, which I've always loved because of how he's kind of slouching in the chair, and admittedly the same way I do in front of my computer when I just don't feel like supporting my back any longer. The show presents a world that may be a fantasy, but still reflects something not as commonly seen in period dramas. That early 19th century England, and by extension, Baltimore, were diverse and colorful places in all senses of the words. Through its design, the show acknowledges this material past while also recognizing that this is a show for a contemporary audience. Bridgerton sets not only our current concepts of historical empathy, design aesthetics, and casting equality in the present, but also looks towards the future and what we might want these shows to become. An exactly historically accurate show will not be accurate in 20 years as historians continue to update research, but a show that acknowledges what we do know while speaking to its contemporary audience has the potential to do much more. Engagement with history, debates about history, and potentially empathy for history, while addressing the past's inherent flaws, is what makes this show a meaningful contributor to bringing a taste of the 19th century into our homes. So I wanted to thank you all for coming to attend today's talk with Homewood Museum at the Johns Hopkins University. We appreciate your participation in our virtual program and look forward to seeing you the next time you're in Baltimore. I put my email address on the screen here for just a moment in case you have any further questions about either today's talk or Homewood Museum. For now, though, I think we actually have a few minutes left, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. For that, I'd like to invite Barbara St. Ars to join me to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, Michelle. That was a great talk. Thank you so much. So interesting, so many details that you were able to squeeze in those 50 minutes. So really appreciate that. And our guests from the comments agree. So I have one good question. So the season was October through June, the social season. What did folks do July through September?
Oh, that's a really great question. For that, if anybody is looking more to just finding more movies to watch or something, I would recommend watching a couple Jane Austen things, because there's a little bit of that you see going on there. A lot of times, and Daphne actually mentions this in Bridgerton, they're going to country houses during that period, or in spending time in their country estates. And usually that's a different sort of social network that they're tapping into, still a very select wealthy elite, but there's a little bit less balls and a little bit more overseeing of that land.
And we know in Baltimore, they were trying to get out of the city because of the pollution and the
yes, it was hot.
Yeah, here, but I don't know in England if it was as bad, but I do know that they go to their country houses. Someone writes that the final ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Hastings, she noticed that everyone was dressed in blue. Was that typical? Or were there themes that were used in the balls? And such a rowdy ball with an opera or circus performer, was that kind of common, or?
Yeah, sure. So for everyone, that's a really good observation. Everyone dressed in blue in that scene, that's definitely a design choice where you see sort of the Bridgerton blue dominating and having that sort of family unity, I would argue. But the concept of costuming for balls or theming balls was absolutely something that was done in this period. Probably the most famous case study in England I would point towards, and I will say I'm an Americanist, as you can tell from this talk, so everyone is welcome to correct me. But the Duchess of Devonshire is a really great example of someone who's really tapping into some of the more elaborate entertainments that you could be doing for that era.
Great. And did Regency women in general resist wearing dresses a second time? The Featherington girls did protest against this at their suggestion.
No, it's yeah, I would say that it was just not the most economically practical to be only wearing a dress once. You see how much in the show, how much work goes into crafting a dress, and how many visits. And we talked a little bit in the talk today about the amount of import that also is going on in the trade, in the textile trade. So that is something that they probably would have reworn, just on the basis of the amount of time that goes into it too. Actually, especially in America, you have some great letters from George Washington talking about styles. He's trying to import interior styles, so not costuming, but he has to say something like, in the best style. Well, what does that mean for the merchant? He just trusts that the merchant knows whatever the best style is at the time. So you also have like time being an issue. You have communication being an issue. There's a lot going into just ordering one dress or one piece of furniture or something.
And I also know too, they repurposed a lot of garments, right? From season to season, they would put a bodice with a different skirt and vice versa. And
exactly.
Increase their options.
You see a lot with surviving historical garments, or I shouldn't say a lot, but you see sometimes where they've been altered at some point, because it's the same thing we would do with hand-me-downs now, and you just kind of make it a little bit hipper for the time.
Do you have any theories of why Lady Featherington's garments are styled with such modern styles? Why that was a choice and why they chose it?
That's a good question. It definitely was a choice. It does give her, it makes her stand out. I think that goes to sort of that reoccurring pattern that the designers talk about, where they're constantly trying to emphasize that the Featheringtons are new money, and that the Featheringtons aren't, she had that interesting quote that they're not educated in the same way. So I think the overall impression of their design that is especially hammered home with Mrs. Featherington's dresses is that they're almost there. They're almost speaking the same language, but they're not quite in terms of this style. And they're sort of, how they stand out sort of shows that they're not quite on the same beat that the Bridgertons and the Queen and everything are.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we're coming up, we have one more minute, so I have a few more questions.
Sure.
You've heard that at some point it was inappropriate for women to have their arms showing during the day, but it was okay at night.
Yeah, I am definitely more of a furniture person.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that is something you see with a lot of the day clothes, where there's a little bit more coverage going on in the day than in the night, in this period especially.
Mm-hmm. And somebody else made the comment, interesting, that she wishes it could go on for another hour.
We can all watch Bridgerton together.
And then some person asks, are you team Duke or team Prince and Prince for Daphne?
I love that question. I'm gonna make a controversial statement, I think, if I answer either way, but I'm gonna go ahead and answer and say I'm team Prince, because he just seems like a really nice guy. I feel like he should have gotten a chance. Duke is fine too, though.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And who is your favorite character based on their wardrobe?
Oh, I like that. Definitely Queen Charlotte. I think that the choices made by the designers to have her sort of stand out constantly with these huge, I think her wigs are amazing, and the thought put into that. And I, while appreciating that it's not really the historically accurate depiction of Queen Charlotte for this period, I think including her in this with these really amazing costumes has an amazing aesthetic effect.
Right. Okay, well, that about wraps it up. And a couple of people have asked, will the show be, the show is being recorded, and we will send all the registrants a copy of the recording so they can watch at their leisure. So, Lori?
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful presentation. And thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you're going to stay in touch with Homewood Museum. We have a slide, I believe, of our website up, so you can all take note of that. That is the go-to place to learn about upcoming virtual programs, both at Homewood Museum and also at our sister museum, Evergreen Museum and Library. And it's also the place to go if you're interested in learning about our membership program and how to support the museum. So please do check out our website when you have a chance. We have many programs coming up this spring, and we hope you will stay in touch with us. And Michelle, again, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And Barbara, thank you again for running behind all the details to make this afternoon such a great success. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.